This lesson, we're going to dig a little deeper as we go beyond just dominant and recessive alleles. Now, as we start looking at other patterns of inheritance, basically what this means is we're going to have to go a little bit beyond just the typical dominant and recessive alleles. So remember that dominant and recessive mean that if there's a dominant allele present, then the dominant phenotype will be present in the offspring. However, if there are no dominant alleles present, only recessive alleles, then the recessive trait or phenotype will be expressed. All right, so here in this particular Punnett square, we have what's called 4 o'clock plants. These are the flowers of the 4 o'clock plants, and they have genes for flower color that really don't follow the strict dominance pattern that Mendel saw in the different characteristics of the pea plants that he was looking at. In the 4 o'clock plants, the alleles for red and white flowers show what's called incomplete dominance. So when we have heterozygous plants, those plants actually show pink flowers. So it's a mix of both the red and the white coloring, red being dominant and white being for the recessive allele. So are the parent plants going to be homozygous or heterozygous for flower color? Well, in this case, they would have to be homozygous. One would have to be homozygous dominant, and one would have to be homozygous recessive, which is exactly what we see here, homozygous dominant and homozygous recessive. So would the offspring be homozygous or heterozygous for flower color? Well, if we had two homozygous parents, one homozygous dominant, one homozygous recessive, you can see that the results are all the same where we have all heterozygous offspring. So could plants with pink flowers produce any offspring that have red flowers? Well, the answer is an absolutely yes, because each parent could actually give a big R allele, the dominant allele, for flower color to its offspring, which would make that offspring homozygous for red colors. Another exception to Mendel's principles is what's called codominance. And in codominance, the phenotypes produced by both alleles are both clearly expressed. There are some varieties of chickens, for example, where the allele for black feathers is codominant with the allele for white feathers. So you get a mix, you get like a speckled chicken. So heterozygous chickens have a color described as erminette, or what we might call speckled, have some both black and white feathers. So how is incomplete dominance different from codominance? Well, the answer to that is in incomplete dominance, the traits are blended, but in codominance, both of the traits are distinctly expressed. There's also a pattern called multiple alleles. Now, you're probably familiar with the concept of blood types. You got type A, type B, type O, type AB, type O negative, type O positive, and those sorts of things. Well, when there are more than two alleles for a gene, that's actually very common in lots of populations of organisms. So it's important to understand that any given individual in this population will still only have two of those alleles. But in the case of human blood types, some alleles also show codominance. So if you have the A and the B alleles, they actually are codominant with each other. A and B are each dominant over O, though. So the Rh factor is inherited independently of the blood type alleles. So Rh positive is dominant over Rh negative. So that's where you get the AB positive or AB negative. The positive and negative is indicative of the Rh factor. Now, to illustrate a little further how a gene can exist in more than two forms, we have some rabbits here that can provide an example. So, for instance, if we have a big C that is full color, we have big C, little c, and an H, that's going to be what we call chinchilla color. Color. There we go. If we have big C, little h, that would result in what we call Himalayan color. And a little c is white, or really albino, which means no color. So you could come up with lots of different genetic crosses for coat color in rabbits. And we'll get into trying some of these multiple allele combinations using Punnett squares at some point. Now, the last of the alternative patterns is what's called polygenic traits. The definition of polygenic traits is traits that are produced by the interaction of several genes. So how are multiple alleles different from polygenic traits? Well, the difference is that multiple alleles refers to different forms of alleles for a single gene, whereas polygenic traits refers to multiple genes that influence a single trait. Now, a lot of students sometimes think that one gene is always responsible for one trait, and that's not quite right. In fact, such a case is actually pretty rare, even though that's what we've been learning so far. Most traits, like things like hair color and eye color, particularly in humans, are actually influenced by multiple genes. So that means that they are polygenic. So it is also true that the environment can actually affect how genes are expressed. And by doing so, it influences genetically determined traits and how they're represented. And a great example of this is the western white butterfly. These are found throughout northwestern North America. And some people have noticed over the years that western whites hatching in the summer had different color patterns on their wings than the ones that hatched in the spring. So some scientific studies were ensued, and they came up with the reason. It turns out that butterflies hatching in the shorter days of springtime had greater levels of pigment in their wings, making their markings appear darker than those that were hatching in the longer days of summer. In other words, the environment in which the butterflies develop influences the expression of their genes for wing coloration. In fact, the pictures here show the buckeye butterflies, which show a similar pattern. They're a little darker in the summer than they are when they're born in the fall or the autumn. So the characteristics of any organism, whether it's a plant, a fruit fly, or a human being, are not determined solely by the genes that the organism inherits. Genes provide a plan for development, but how that plan unfolds can also depend on the environment. So if we were to fill in these blanks, what we would come up with is that the phenotype of an organism is only partly determined by its genotype, which is a little bit turning what we've been learning so far on its head. Now, consider the case of the butterflies and why being darker in the autumn than in the summer might be useful. Well, if you think about it, in order to fly effectively, the body temperature of the butterfly has to be about 84 to 104 degrees. Because the spring months are cooler in the west, greater pigmentation helps them reach that body temperature needed for flight, because darker colors attract more heat from sunlight. In the hot summer months, similarly, less pigmentation enables the moths to avoid from overheating. So, the environment, when we talk about the environment in this context, it refers to internal factors as well, not just external factors. For example, both men and women can have genes for male pattern baldness, but baldness shows up more often in men because male hormones trigger the expression of that gene.